The boy ran across the gas station parking lot toward the most dangerous-looking man in 3 counties, and his mother's heart stopped completely. She should have been faster. She should have grabbed his hand the moment he stiffened with excitement. The moment she saw his eyes light up in that specific way that meant Caleb Morrison has found something fascinating and absolutely nothing on earth will stop him from investigating it. But she'd been reaching for her purse in the passenger seat, 2 seconds of inattention, and that was all it took. He was already halfway across the hot Tennessee asphalt before the word Caleb had fully formed in her throat. The man he was running toward stood 6'3" in his boots. He weighed somewhere north of 240 pounds, and almost none of it was excess. Every visible inch of skin below his jawline carried ink. A full sleeve of dark geometric work on the right arm. A sprawling piece across his left that incorporated what looked like a compass rose overtaken by thorns, and at the base of his throat, just above the collar of his black t-shirt, the faded edge of something she couldn't read from here. His leather vest carried patches she recognized in the way that people in small towns recognize certain license plates, with a cold, instinctive sinking in the chest. The Death's Head insignia. The bottom rocker that said Tennessee. The center patch she didn't let herself look at for more than a quarter of a second. His motorcycle sat cooling on the far pump. A custom-built Harley-Davidson that looked like it had been ridden through a war and had opinions about it. It was ticking quietly in the heat. Everything about the man and the machine said, "Stay away." He turned. He saw the child coming. His hand, still wrapped around the pump handle, went very still. Here we go, Sarah thought. Here is where I find out exactly what kind of man this is. And then Caleb planted his sneakers on the asphalt 6 feet in front of the stranger, tilted his head back as far as it would go, and looked straight up at 6 feet and 3 inches of scarred, road-worn, death's head-patched biker, with the serene confidence of someone who has never once doubted that the universe is fundamentally on his side. "Are you a superhero?" Caleb asked. It was the kind of August afternoon that turned Tennessee into something resembling a fever dream. Jackson Briggs had been riding for 3 days straight, with 4 hours of sleep in a roadside motel in Georgia, and the particular internal quietness that came not from peace, but from the deliberate suppression of everything that wasn't the road and the engine and the mile markers ticking past. He'd learned to do that in the Army, to compartmentalize so completely that the compartments themselves became a kind of architecture you lived inside. Clean lines. No leakage between rooms. He'd been at Ray's funeral 5 days ago. Ray Kowalski, 47 years old. Dead of cancer he hadn't told anyone about until it was 6 weeks from the end. Jackson had stood at the graveside in Knoxville while Ray's widow pressed an envelope into his hands and said he wanted you to have this. And Jackson had pocketed the letter without opening it because he hadn't been ready, and now here he was, 3 days and 600 miles from that cemetery, and he still wasn't ready. The envelope was in his inside breast pocket, against his heart. He'd been aware of it the entire ride. A constant, low-grade pressure, like a bruise he kept forgetting to stop touching. He pulled into the gas station in Millhaven, Tennessee, without any particular intention. The bike needed fuel. He needed water. The town was a dot on the map, 1 gas station, 1 stoplight, a feed store, a diner that had been there since 1974 judging by the sign. The kind of town you passed through and forgot. He was filling the tank, watching the numbers turn on the pump, when he heard footsteps. Fast ones. The light, slapping sound of small sneakers on hot pavement, coming toward him with a speed and directness that his ranger-trained peripheral awareness flagged as incoming before his rational mind had caught up to the fact that it was a child. He turned. The boy was maybe 6. Dark hair cut close on the sides, big eyes the color of creek water in summer, wearing a t-shirt with a faded dinosaur on it. He was, Jackson noted, completely unafraid. Not the cautious curiosity of a child who'd been told to be careful around strangers. Not the wide-eyed paralysis of a kid who'd suddenly realized he'd made a mistake getting this close. Just open. Forthright. Like approaching a tattooed biker on a hot afternoon was an entirely normal activity for a Tuesday. He planted his feet on the asphalt and looked up. Jackson looked down. "Are you a superhero?" the boy asked. It was not a question Jackson Briggs had been asked before. In 42 years of living, 8 years of Army service, 2 tours in Iraq, 15 years of road miles and chapter meetings, and the complicated life of a man who existed in the margins of respectable society, He had been asked many things. He had been asked for money, for drugs, for fights, for directions. He had been asked to leave establishments, cross state lines, testify, and once, memorably, to play Santa Claus at a chapter Christmas party because the original Santa had broken his collarbone the day before. He had never been asked, by anyone, if he was a superhero. The question sat in the air between them. Jackson was, for just a moment, entirely without a response. "No," he said finally. "Kid, I'm not." The boy tilted his head, unimpressed by this answer. "But you have a skull on your jacket," he said, pointing at the death's head patch with the directness of a child who hasn't learned yet that pointing is rude. "And you have scars." He pointed at Jackson's forearm, where a thick white ridge of scar tissue traced a path from wrist to elbow, a souvenir from Fallujah that Jackson no longer thought about unless someone pointed it out. "And your motorcycle is really cool. My teacher says that heroes don't look like what you expect." Jackson stared at him. "Does your teacher have an opinion on motorcycle clubs?" Jackson said. "I don't think so," the boy said thoughtfully. "She mostly talks about reading and Martin Luther King. My name's Caleb." "Jackson, that's a president name," Caleb said, nodding approval. Running footsteps. Jackson looked up and saw the woman coming, dark hair escaping from a messy braid, wearing scrubs in a shade of blue that suggested a medical job, reaching for the boy with an expression that was equal parts relief and mortification. She caught Caleb's shoulder and pulled him gently back. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Caleb, what did I tell you about running off?" "I was talking to the superhero," Caleb said, completely unfazed. "He's not a—" She stopped herself, looking up at Jackson. The expression on her face was the one he knew by heart, the careful, calibrated look of someone assessing how much danger they were in. He'd been seeing that look for years. Most people hid it less well than they thought. "He's not a problem," Jackson said evenly. "Kid's fine." Something shifted in her expression. The assessment recalibrated. She had a professional steadiness about her, the kind of person who'd been trained to stay functional in crises, and she deployed it now, smoothing over the embarrassment with a practiced breath. "Thank you," she said. "He's just curious," Jackson said. "Nothing wrong with that." She smiled, brief, a little tired, and genuine enough that it reached her eyes before she had time to decide whether it should. "Sarah," she said, "that's Caleb. We're going now." She started to turn, hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Bye, Jackson," Caleb called back, waving with his whole arm, the way small children wave when they consider someone a new friend. "I still think you might be a superhero." Jackson watched them walk to a 10-year-old blue Civic at the next pump. He watched Sarah buckle Caleb in. He watched her close the door and stand with her hand on the car roof for just a moment, eyes closed, taking a breath. He noticed the bruise on her right wrist. It was faded, 3, maybe 4 days old, the greenish yellow of a contusion well past its worst, but not yet gone. She was wearing the sleeve of a light jacket on an August afternoon in Tennessee, and it had ridden up when she'd reached for Caleb. She hadn't reached for the sleeve. She'd trained herself not to do that, which meant she'd been doing this long enough to develop habits around it. Jackson looked away. He watched them pull out of the station in his peripheral vision. He noticed that Sarah checked both mirrors twice before she pulled onto Route 9, and that she checked the rear view again 30 seconds later after she'd already cleared the lot. She was watching for someone. "Not your problem," Jackson told himself. He got back on the bike. He rode. 3 miles outside of Millhaven, the engine quit. It wasn't a surprise, exactly. The Harley had been running hot since Atlanta. He'd noticed the temperature creeping and told himself he'd deal with it in Nashville. Men like Jackson had a complicated relationship with the word later. It was a word that had gotten him into more trouble than most people would believe, and also, paradoxically, kept him alive on at least 2 occasions when acting immediately would have been the last thing he ever did. Today, later arrived in the form of a gradually louder knocking noise followed by a sound like a very large and very unhappy sigh, and then silence. He coasted to the gravel shoulder, put the stand down, and sat for a moment with his hands on his knees in the posture of a man conducting an internal inventory of his life choices. The inventory took about 45 seconds. He called Ghost. "Talk," said Marcus Reyes, who answered the phone the way he'd been answering it for 20 years. Economically, efficiently, as if words were a resource to be managed. "Broke down in Millhaven," Jackson said. A short pause. "Tennessee, Millhaven." How many Millhavens are there? Presumably more than 0, or you wouldn't have asked. Another pause. I'm 6 hours out. Maybe 5 if I push it. Don't push it, Jackson said, which was what he always said when he wanted Ghost to push it. I'll find a shop. Bill's auto and cycle occupied a converted barn on the east edge of town, and Bill himself, 65 years old, sun-weathered, with oil permanently embedded under his fingernails and the unhurried manner of a man who had long since made peace with time, was exactly the kind of mechanic that Jackson's experience had taught him to trust. Not the slick ones with new equipment and laminated price lists. The ones with 30 years of coffee cans full of salvaged bolts and the ability to look at an engine and read it like a language. Bill looked at the Harley for approximately 4 minutes without speaking. Head gasket, he said finally. Thought so. Got a couple things close to what I need in back. Not everything. Parts coming from Chattanooga. He looked up. Tomorrow afternoon, maybe tomorrow evening. Jackson looked at the sky, then at the town, then at the sky again. All right, he said. He found a room at the Millhaven Motor Inn, 12 units, a vending machine that dispensed everything except the things he wanted, a window AC unit that made a sound like a man trying to start a reluctant argument. He'd had worse. He didn't think about the worse ones very often anymore, though occasionally they visited him at 3 a.m. without being invited. He showered and changed and went walking. He did this in every new place he found himself. Not sightseeing, exactly, but something closer to reconnaissance. A holdover from the Rangers that he'd never been able to switch off. He walked the grid of Millhaven's streets in the declining afternoon heat and cataloged what he saw. The feed store, the barber, a pharmacy with a hand-lettered sign about their hours, the Methodist church, a small park where someone had planted flowers around a veteran's memorial. 2 bars, one of which appeared to be open and one of which appeared to have given up some time ago. The county sheriff's office, small, underlit, a patrol truck in the lot with a cracked windshield someone hadn't gotten around to fixing. And Danny Voss's truck. Jackson hadn't known it was Danny Voss's truck at the time. He'd noticed it the way he noticed everything. A newer, lifted F-250 with dark windows and aftermarket everything. The kind of truck that belonged to a man who wanted people to know he had money and wasn't particularly concerned about why they thought he had it. It was parked outside the hardware store. The hardware store was closed. The truck hadn't moved in what the dust pattern suggested was a while. 3 men were leaning against it, not doing anything in particular. Watching the street, Jackson walked past without altering his pace or his expression. The men watched him in the way that people who spend a lot of time watching streets watch everything, automatically, categorically, filing him under a tab. He filed them under a tab of his own. By the time he turned the corner toward Rosie's Home Cooking, whose hand-painted sign promised hot plates and free pie on Tuesdays, he had a rough sketch of Millhaven that went a few layers deeper than its surface. A town with money moving through it that didn't quite match the economy you could see. A town where certain people were watched and certain people were watching. A town that had learned, in the particular way that small towns learn things, to look at certain situations from a different angle, or not to look at all. Not your problem, the voice said. Jackson pushed open the door to Rosie's. Caleb saw him first. Jackson had barely cleared the door when he heard the boy's voice cut across the ambient noise of a half-full diner with the authority that 6-year-olds deploy when they've located something important. Mom, it's the superhero from the gas station. Sarah Morrison had been in the middle of a sentence about something involving the hospital cafeteria. She stopped mid-word. She turned. She looked at Jackson with an expression that was several things at once: surprise, mild alarm, and, underneath both, something else. Something that looked, if he was reading it right, a little like relief. Jackson had been seen as many things in his life. He had not previously been seen as a source of relief by a woman who'd just met him that afternoon. He gave a small nod toward their booth and moved to the counter, taking a stool with his back to the wall. An old habit so deeply grooved it no longer required thought, like breathing. Rosie herself appeared from behind the counter with the ground-covering efficiency of a woman who'd been on her feet for 40 years without ever developing bad posture. She was 60-something, broad-shouldered, with a white braid wound around her head and the kind of eyes that absorbed information fast and filed it accurately. Coffee, she said. Please, Jackson said. Passing through, trying to. He picked up the menu. Bike's in the shop. Bill's. Yeah. He's good. she said, with a certainty that settled the matter. She poured the coffee without being asked about cream or sugar, correctly reading him, he thought, and moved off to check on another table. He could hear Caleb, 2 stools down, asking his mother in an urgent undertone if he could go say hello and being told no. Let the man have his dinner in peace. Caleb, he doesn't want to be bothered. I don't mind, Jackson said. He said it before he decided to say it. It came out in the quiet, deliberate way his voice worked. Not an invitation exactly, more an available fact. There was a short silence, then the sound of Caleb sliding off the vinyl bench. He appeared at the stool next to Jackson and climbed up with the focused efficiency of someone scaling a mountain. He settled himself, folded his hands on the counter, and turned to face Jackson with an expression of complete readiness. Okay, Caleb said. First question, how fast does your motorcycle go? The next 20 minutes were unlike any Jackson had spent in recent memory. Caleb had questions at a frequency and variety that reminded Jackson of a government briefing, except more coherent and considerably more interesting. How fast? Did it ever fall over? What did the tattoos mean? All of them, starting with the visible ones. And could he see the ones on Jackson's arm? He could. What did this one mean? And this one? Were you in the military? His grandpa was in the military. Did you know Grandpa? Probably not. He lived in Florida. Are you in a gang? Are gangs bad? Jackson answered honestly. He had not. He reflected, answered that many direct questions honestly in quite some time. Some gangs are bad, he said, to the last question. Some are just men who ride together and look out for each other. Like a team. Like the Avengers? Caleb said. Sure, Jackson said. Like the Avengers. Caleb considered this. Iron Man's my favorite, he said. Mine too, Jackson said. This was a lie, but it was the most comfortable lie he'd told in years. Sarah arrived at the counter on some pretext about needing a refill, but she didn't go back to the booth. She stood, cup in hand, with the slightly apologetic air of a mother monitoring her son's social behavior. And Jackson learned more about her in the next 10 minutes than he had from the whole afternoon. That she was a nurse at Millhaven County Hospital, working the pediatric unit, that she'd been in Millhaven for 4 years, that she'd come from Nashville originally, that she was fine. She always said she was fine in a way that managed to be both true and comprehensively incomplete. He noticed she kept a small, unconscious watch on the door. The door opened. Danny Voss was 38 and built like a man who'd been athletic in his early 20s and had since added to the architecture without removing anything. He had cold, light gray eyes that moved through a room like they owned it, and a smile that occupied his face without reaching those eyes by a significant distance. He was wearing a collared shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, which Jackson noted, and expensive boots, which Jackson also noted. And behind him came 2 men who had the specific quality of men whose professional purpose was proximity. The room changed when Danny walked in. It was subtle. No one made a sound. No one moved visibly, but something in the ambient noise shifted by a half step. The couple in the far booth became interested in their plates. Rosie, behind a counter, became suddenly focused on wiping something that was already clean. It was the particular social physics of a room that had learned, collectively, how to make itself smaller when certain people entered it. Danny's eyes found Sarah in under 3 seconds. He slid into her booth across from her as if gravity had simply deposited him there. His 2 men remained standing, one near the door, one in the aisle beside the booth, not touching anything, simply being present in the way that a closed fist is present even when it hasn't moved yet. Jackson had not turned on his stool. He was watching in the chrome surface of the napkin dispenser. You haven't been answering my calls, Danny said. His voice was easy, conversational, carefully pleasant. It was a well-practiced voice. I've been busy, Sarah said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was gone, replaced by something careful and flat. The voice of a person who has learned that certain conversations require all the softness removed from them. You look busy. His eyes moved briefly to the counter, to the boy, to Jackson, playing happy families. Caleb and I were just having dinner. I need the boy this weekend, Danny said. He's coming to stay with me. That's not happening. Sarah. The word was gentle. The gentleness was the threat. One of Danny's men shifted the hand nearest the booth, not touching the back of the seat, just near it. Jackson set his fork down. He did it quietly. He turned on his stool, slowly, the way a man turns when he has time, and isn't particularly concerned about being noticed doing it. He looked at Danny directly. "Looks like the lady's not interested in the conversation," Jackson said. His voice was even, conversational, calibrated to carry exactly as far as the booth. "Might be worth giving her some space." The diner went very quiet. Danny turned his head and looked at Jackson the way a man looks at something he's deciding whether to move around or move through. "You're new here," he said. It wasn't entirely a question, just passing through. Then passed through. The smile stayed on. "This is private." Jackson looked at Caleb. The boy was very still on his stool, watching with those open creek-colored eyes that had seen this scene before, not understanding every piece of it, but understanding the architecture of danger the way children always do, in the body before the mind, as a change in the air and the quality of the adults' voices. He was holding Jackson's sleeve. Jackson hadn't felt him take hold of it. "I'll head out," Jackson said, standing and pulling out his wallet to drop bills on the counter, "when the lady's ready to go." He looked at Sarah. "Ma'am." It was a small thing to offer. It was only standing up and looking at a door. But Sarah Morrison straightened on the bench, and her chin came up by a quarter inch, and she said, "Caleb, we're going." And she collected her son from the counter stool, and the three of them walked out of Rosie's home cooking in a particular order. Caleb first, Sarah second, and Jackson last, between Sarah's back and the room behind her, filling the space as simply and completely as a door. Behind them, Danny Voss watched them go. His smile didn't change. That was the part that stayed with Jackson. Outside in the parking lot, in the cooling dark, Sarah said thank you. Jackson said it was nothing. She looked at him for a moment with those eyes that a life in medicine had made very good at reading things people weren't saying out loud. "No," she said. "It wasn't nothing." He walked them to their car. Caleb held his hand for part of the way, naturally, as if this was established practice, and Jackson led him. At the car, while Sarah unlocked it and Caleb climbed in, Jackson spoke quietly. "How long has he been doing this?" She paused with her hand on the door. "Does it matter?" "It might." A long silence. Crickets in the lot grass. The distant sound of a truck on the highway. "He's Danny Voss," she said finally. "His cousin is Tom Haley, the county sheriff. Danny runs most of the drug distribution through 4 counties out of this town. Everyone in Millhaven knows. Has known for years. Nobody does anything, because there's no point doing anything when the man you'd report it to goes to Thanksgiving at the same table." She looked at her wrist, the bruised one, without seeming to realize she was doing it. Then she pulled the sleeve down. "I filed a restraining order 8 months ago. The sheriff's office lost the paperwork. I refiled it. They lost it again." Jackson said nothing. "I'm a nurse," Sarah said. "I make good enough money to keep this house and give Caleb a decent life. I like my job. I like this town mostly. And she stopped. "I ran once before. From Nashville, when this started. I thought a new town would make a new situation. It didn't. He found us." She looked at Caleb through the window. "I'm done running. This is our home. I'm not going to teach my son that the answer to a bully is to keep moving." Jackson stood with his hands in his pockets for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Good night, Sarah." She looked at him. "Good night, Jackson." He walked back to the motel. The night was warm and smelled like cut grass and diesel, and the particular sweetness of a town settling into its evening routine. He sat on the concrete step outside his room with the room, key in his hand, and did not go inside for a while. He called Ghost. Ghost answered on the second ring. "Talk," said Ghost. Jackson talked. He laid it out in the compact, organized manner of a man who had briefed operations before, what he'd seen, what he'd been told, what he'd assessed. The corrupt sheriff, the distribution network, the restraining order made to disappear twice, the bruise on the wrist of a woman who had stopped trying to hide it from her sleeve and started trying to hide it from her own eyes. Ghost was quiet through all of it. "Jack," he said when Jackson stopped, "we said we were done with this kind of thing. I know. The chapter won't back you on this. Not this far outside our territory. I'm not asking the chapter." Silence on the line. Ghost breathing. "Who are you asking?" he said. "I'm asking my brother," Jackson said. "Are you still 5 hours out?" 4.5 now, Ghost said. "I was already going a little fast." Jackson almost smiled. "Don't push it." He hung up. He sat in the dark with his hand on his breast pocket, feeling the shape of Ray's letter through the leather. He had carried it for 5 days without opening it, and the weight of it had changed over those 5 days, from something he was protecting himself from, to something he was orbiting, to something that felt, increasingly, like a message he already half knew the contents of and was waiting for the right moment to confirm. Not tonight. Tonight he was tired in a way that lived below the muscle, in the place where the things he'd seen and done and failed to do had accumulated over 20 years like water in a basement you'd learn not to go into. He thought about a village in Al-Anbar province in the winter of 2007. He thought about a woman he hadn't been able to protect. He thought about the operational report that had called the outcome acceptable. He thought about his daughter Lily, who was 19 now and studying environmental science in Chattanooga, and who had called him twice in the last year with the patient determination of someone extending a hand over and over into a dark room, waiting. He thought about a 6-year-old boy who had no fear. Are you a superhero? He went inside. He set an alarm for 5 a.m. He closed his eyes. He slept and did not dream, which was the best he usually hoped for. Marcus Ghost Reyes arrived at 4:47 in the morning. Black Road King rolling into the motel lot so quietly that Jackson, watching from the room window, heard the engine cut from 50 yards out before he saw the headlight. Ghost was lean and silver-haired and had the economy of motion that came from 30 years of being in situations where unnecessary movement had consequences. He and Jackson had served together in the 75th Ranger Regiment, Jackson's second tour, Ghost's third, and had emerged from it with the kind of friendship that doesn't require maintenance because it's load-bearing by nature. They had argued for those 25 years with approximately the same frequency and the same specific irresolvability as tectonic plates, and they trusted each other with the totality of the word. They sat in the parking lot on the concrete parking bumpers with coffee from the gas station 3 blocks over, in the still dark morning air, and Jackson laid out what he knew. Ghost listened. He'd always been the better listener. Danny Voss, Ghost said when Jackson finished. I pulled everything I could find driving in. Federal database has him as a person of interest in a DEA investigation that went cold in 2021. Not enough local cooperation to make the case. Tennessee State Bureau of Investigation has an open file that hasn't moved in 18 months. 2 men died in the county in the past year. One a drowning, one a construction accident. Both were connected to the distribution network. And the sheriff. Evidence of at least 6 instances of obstruction in documented cases involving Danny Voss. 3 protective orders that were filed and disappeared, not all Sarah's. The system is broken locally because the man who's supposed to run the system is on the payroll. Jackson stared at the lightening sky above the tree line. Deputy Amy Chun, he said. Ghost raised an eyebrow. I heard her name in the sheriff's office when I walked past yesterday. Someone inside was talking about her. The tone was dismissive. Official language for a problem you don't want to deal with. Jackson looked at Ghost. She's building a case on her own. Has to be. 2 years in that department, and she hasn't quit. She's either building something or she's waiting. Ghost turned the coffee cup in his hands. You want to hand her the piece she's missing. The SBI contact in Knoxville, Ray's brother-in-law. He's been wanting a clean evidence package to justify federal involvement for 2 years. If we give Amy Chun what she needs to make a complete case and facilitate the SBI contact, the federal machinery takes over from the local corruption, Ghost said. Yes. How long to build the evidence package? A day. Maybe less if Chen's further along than I think. Ghost was quiet for a moment. And if Danny moves before the machinery catches up, he said. Jackson looked at him. Then we're here, Jackson said. Ghost exhaled slowly through his nose. He was not a man who did things lightly or dramatically. He absorbed information, weighed it against what he knew and what he'd committed himself to, and arrived at decisions in the quiet, methodical way of someone who had learned that the decision itself mattered less than whether you could hold to it when things stopped going cleanly. Okay, he said. It was not a loud word. It was a load-bearing one. I'll find Amy Chun, Jackson said. You take the SBI contact. And the bike. Bill says afternoon, maybe evening. We might need it before then. I know. Jackson paused. If it comes to it, we work without it. Ghost nodded once, finished his coffee, and stood. I need 2 hours of sleep, he said. Take 3, Jackson said. I'll need you sharp. I'm always sharp, Ghost said, with the absolute, unironic factuality of a man who was correct. It was the second evening when Rosie's text arrived. Jackson was at Bill's shop, watching the rebuilt engine go back together piece by piece, thinking about Deputy Amy Chen's face when he and Ghost had laid the evidence before her that afternoon in the back booth of a coffee shop 12 miles outside Millhaven. She had listened for 40 minutes without interrupting. Then she'd asked 6 precise questions that told him she'd been building toward this case, like a mason laying one brick at a time in the dark. Then she'd reached for her phone and called the SBI contact number he gave her, and her voice had been completely level, and he'd watched her become, in that moment, the officer she'd always been under the circumstances that had been trying to stop her. He was thinking about that, the particular quiet heroism of it, when his phone buzzed. "Rosie, Danny just left with 4 men headed east on Maple direction. I heard him tell Jimmy go to the nurse's house. Thought you should know." Jackson read it twice. He was on his feet before the second read finished. "Ghost," he said. Ghost materialized from the other side of the Harley, as if he'd never stopped being ready. "I heard," Ghost said. He had his own phone out. "I'm calling Chun. Tell her to come with the SBI on speed dial, not the sheriff's office." Already texting, Jackson ran. He moved through the evening streets of Millhaven at a pace that startled the 2 people who saw him. A large man in boots covering ground with a silent, flowing efficiency that didn't quite match his size. A man whose body remembered how to do this even when his mind was trying to compute the fastest route to Maple Street without a motorcycle. The vacant lot behind the dry cleaner. The alley beside the Methodist church. The gap in the fence behind the post office that he'd noted on his reconnaissance walk, because you noted things like that. Always, forever, whether you wanted to or not. Sarah's house was a small blue Craftsman, older, well-kept, window boxes with geraniums, a porch swing that had seen better decades. A light burned in the kitchen. A light burned in an upstairs window that would be Caleb's room. Danny's advance man was already there. Jackson spotted him before he rounded the corner. A lean figure in a dark jacket positioned at the side of the porch. Phone in hand, posture of someone waiting for a signal. Late 20s. Restless. The specific body language of someone who'd been told to be there, but hadn't been told exactly what to do next. Jackson circled to the back. The back door was unlocked. A nurse's house, on a quiet street, in a town that was supposed to be safe. The unlocked door made him angry in a way that wasn't directed at Sarah. It was directed at everything that had made her have to be careful, and at everything that had made her, despite being careful, still not safe enough. He slipped inside. Sarah was at the kitchen sink, reaching for the faucet, and she turned when she heard his footfall, and her breath caught in her throat, and she went very still. He put a finger to his lips. He watched her do the same thing she'd done outside the diner, that deliberate, visible choosing, the decision not to fall apart. He watched her find it in herself, the way he'd watched medics find it on the worst days, the specific quiet competence that some people carried inside them like a compass. "Danny's coming," he said. His voice was barely above a breath. "For men, one's already outside." She didn't ask how he knew. She was a nurse. She dealt in what was happening, not how she felt about it. "Caleb's upstairs," she said. "Get him. Back door, through the yard to the neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She's 76. She won't. She doesn't need to do anything except let you in and lock the door behind you." He looked at her directly. "Called Deputy Chun. Not 911. Not the sheriff. Amy Chun directly. You have her number. She gave it to me 11 months ago. I have it memorized. Go now? Don't wait for anything." She looked at him for 1 second. "Just one. Thank you," she said. Then she was moving, and he heard her feet on the stairs, quick, quiet, purposeful, and her voice low and urgent above him. Caleb's confused question of Mama, and then nothing, because the back door made the smallest sound, and they were gone. Jackson moved to the front of the house. He positioned himself in the doorway and looked at Danny's man on the porch with the calm, assessing gaze that the army had built into him and 15 years of riding had maintained. The man looked up. The phone dropped slightly in his hand. "Hey." "Sit down," Jackson said. "Hands where I can see them. Don't make any sound that carries. Do it now." There was a negotiation in the man's eyes between his ego and his instincts. His instincts won, because instincts are older and wiser than ego, and in situations like this they know things that ego refuses to believe. He sat down. Danny's SUV appeared 2 minutes later. 4 doors. 5 people. Danny in the front passenger seat, which was correct. The man who thinks he controls a situation sits where he can observe it. the driver, and 3 others, one of whom Jackson recognized from the hardware store. Danny got out. He looked at his man sitting on the porch step, hands visible, not doing anything. He looked at the large tattooed figure in the doorway. For a moment, a very brief moment, a flicker in those cold gray eyes, something moved across Danny Voss's face that was not quite fear, but was its immediate neighbor. "Where's Sarah?" he said. "Not here," Jackson said. "Get out of my way." "This isn't your house," Jackson said. "And that's not your family. You should turn around and drive away." Danny's jaw tightened. "Boys," he said. They moved. What happened next was not beautiful. Real violence never is. It is fast and ugly and carries consequences, and Jackson had long since made peace with this. He had been trained by the United States Army's most elite light infantry regiment to incapacitate threats efficiently, and the 15 years that followed had given him the specific combat intelligence of a man who had been in real fights, not the athletic display of a man who hadn't. The first man came in fast and high. Jackson shifted his weight back and right, let the swing carry past him, and drove his elbow into the man's floating rib with a precision that folded him around the impact and put him on the porch boards. The second came with a tire iron. Jackson saw the motion early enough to move his head and take the glancing blow on his forearm instead of his skull, and the cost of that decision was a white-hot line of pain from wrist to elbow, and the benefit was continued consciousness, which he judged a fair trade. He returned with a palm heel strike to the bridge of the man's nose and felt the specific crack of cartilage under his hand. The third man stopped. He'd seen the other 2 go down in the time it takes most people to process that something has started. "Your call," Jackson said to him quietly. The man took a step back. 27 seconds from boys to 3 men neutralized and 1 standing still. Danny had a gun. A compact automatic, drawn from a hip holster, pointed at Jackson's center mass from 8 feet away. His hand was steady enough. This was not a man who hadn't handled firearms, but Jackson had been looking at armed men for most of his adult life, and he knew the difference between a gun in the hand of someone committed to pulling the trigger and a gun in the hand of someone who was still deciding. Danny had not yet decided. "Step aside," Danny said. "No," Jackson said. Across the street, a porch light came on. Then another. A door opened. The specific audible quality of a street that has been paying attention without appearing to. "You think I won't? I think you've spent a long time being the most dangerous thing in a room," Jackson said, "and you've gotten very good at it. I think that skill is largely about making people believe you'll pull that trigger when the cost of pulling it is still low. I think the cost is no longer low." He kept his voice conversational. Calm was a weapon he'd learned to carry. At 4 o'clock this afternoon, the State Bureau of Investigation received a complete evidence package covering your distribution network, your relationship with Sheriff Haley, and 2 deaths that were classified as accidents and were not. That package came from a deputy in your county who has been building a case for 2 years and finally had everything she needed. He let that land. There are currently 9 people on this street watching us, and at least 3 of them have phones out. Shooting me does not make any of those things go away. It makes every single one of them worse. Danny's hand held. In the distance, from the direction of the county line, not from the direction of the sheriff's office, because Ghost had made the calls that needed to be made, sirens. Danny looked at his man on the step, at the 2 men on the ground, at the lights coming on up and down Maple Street, at Jackson standing in the doorway of the blue craftsman house that did not belong to him, and yet from which it had become evident he was not going to move. Danny Voss made the decision that men like Danny always ultimately make when the equation shifts past a certain point. He ran. He got half a block. Deputy Amy Chun had been alone with this for 2 years. 2 years of a notebook kept at her home address because the station wasn't safe. 2 years of recording conversations on a personal phone that she'd bought cash specifically for the purpose. 2 years of learning to exist in a building where her superior was complicit in the exact thing she'd sworn to prevent, of navigating the specific exhaustion of being the only person doing the right thing in an institution that had decided the right thing was too expensive. She had reached out to the SBI 3 separate times. The first time she'd been told there wasn't enough for federal jurisdiction. The second time, she'd been told the same. The third time, the agent she'd spoken to had been quietly replaced, and no one had followed up. She had kept going anyway. Not from optimism. She was not particularly optimistic by nature. From something simpler, and more fundamental. From the understanding that stopping was not a choice she was able to make and still be who she was. When Jackson and Ghost had sat down across from her in that coffee shop that afternoon and laid out what they had, the distribution maps, the financial records, the witness statements, the direct connection to Sheriff Haley's evidence tampering, she had listened to 40 minutes of information with absolute stillness. She had asked 6 questions. Then she had picked up the phone and called the number they gave her, and her voice had been completely level. And the SBI agent on the other end had said, "Deputy Chun, we've been waiting for this call," and something in her chest had performed a structural shift that she wouldn't find words for until much later. She was standing in the middle of Maple Street at 2 in the morning, the blue and red lights of 2 state police cruisers and an SBI vehicle painting the neighborhood in rotating color, when she allowed herself to stop. Just for a moment. Just to feel the complete and enormous weight of what she'd been carrying and the fact that she was no longer carrying it alone. She didn't try to stop the tears. They lasted approximately 90 seconds. Then she went to take statements. She found Jackson sitting on Sarah's front porch steps, left forearm wrapped in a makeshift compression bandage that someone had fashioned from a dish towel. He was watching the police lights with the expression of a man who has completed something and is now inhabiting the quiet on the other side of it. "I need your statement," Amy said. "I know. You also broke 3 noses and possibly a cheekbone." 2 noses, Jackson said. "The cheekbone is separate." Amy sat down on the step beside him. She sat for a moment without speaking, watching the same lights. "Thank you," she said finally. Jackson shook his head, starting to deflect, and she stopped him. "No," she said. "Don't do that. Don't minimize it. That's what you do. You do enormous things, and then you make them smaller because you're afraid of what it means if you let them be large." She looked at him directly, with the eyes of someone who'd spent 2 years learning to see clearly in the dark. It was enormous. It mattered. The evidence mattered. Tonight mattered. She paused. "You mattered." Jackson looked at her. He was quiet for a long time. A moth circled the porch light above them. One of the state police officers was speaking into a radio. Somewhere down the street, a screen door opened, and someone asked what was happening. "Yeah," Jackson said quietly. "Yeah," he said again, as if confirming it to himself. Morning came to Millhaven with the particular clarity that arrives after a summer storm. The air washed, the light different, everything familiar and subtly rearranged. Danny Voss had been arrested 1 block from Maple Street. Sheriff Tom Haley had been arrested at his home, in his bathrobe, holding a phone he'd been frantically trying to use to reach Danny's lawyer. 2 of Danny's men were in the county hospital being assessed. 2 others were in custody. By 9 a.m., the county seat 20 miles south was waking up to news that would be in the state papers by noon. Amy Chun was at the station, acting sheriff, as of an hour ago, by the county commissioner's emergency appointment. She sat in the sheriff's chair, and it fit her, Jackson thought, the way a key fits a lock. Not because it was hers by right, but because she had earned the shape of it. Sarah came back to the house with Caleb at dawn, escorted by Amy personally. She walked up the path with her son's hand in hers, and found Jackson still on the porch steps, the ice bag from the freezer long since warm in his hands, the dish towel still wrapped around his forearm. He'd sat there through the night, more or less, not keeping watch anymore. The need had passed, but not quite ready to leave either, which he understood less clearly. Caleb saw him from the garden path. The boy let go of his mother's hand. He ran, full tilt, no hesitation. The same footsteps Jackson had heard in the gas station parking lot. The same absolute absence of fear, but different this time, because this time there was no mother chasing him, no strangers watching, no question about what he was running toward. Jackson had stood up by instinct when he heard the feet on the path, and Caleb hit him at approximately sternum height and wrapped both arms around his neck and held on. Jackson's arms came up around the boy. He held him the way he held very few things. Carefully, fully, without reservation. "I knew it," Caleb said, his voice muffled against Jackson's shoulder. The total conviction of someone whose theory has been definitively confirmed. "I knew you were a superhero." "I'm not a superhero," Jackson said, but his voice was different. The words were the same, but they had lost their certainty, like a door that no longer quite closes flush. He set Caleb down and looked at Sarah. She was standing a few feet back, watching him. She had shadows under her eyes, and her braid had come all the way undone and she looked like a woman who had passed through something that rearranges the interior landscape, tired and clear-eyed, and, underneath both, unmistakably lighter. "Are you okay?" he said. "I will be," she said. "I think I will be this time." She paused. "Why did you do this? You were going to leave. You were just passing through." Jackson looked at his hands for a moment. 15 years ago, he said slowly, I was in a village in Al-Anbar province, Iraq. There was a family, a woman and 2 children. We had intelligence that suggested insurgent activity in the area. My team moved too fast. We didn't stop to confirm what we were walking into. He paused. When it was over, they weren't there. I never found out what happened to them. I never found out if someone, he stopped. I filed a report. The report used the word acceptable. I used to wake up at 3 in the morning wondering what that word had cost. Sarah sat down beside him on the step. She didn't say anything. She didn't offer comfort or comparison or any of the things people reach for to fill a silence like that. She simply sat, which was, he found, exactly right. I have a voice, Jackson said after a while. That tells me things aren't my problem. I've been listening to it for a long time. I think it was trying to protect me from repeating something. But somewhere along the way, he looked up at the August morning, the washed blue of the Tennessee sky, the geraniums in the window boxes that Sarah had planted and tended through a year of fear. Somewhere along the way, it started protecting me from the right things instead of the wrong ones. Or maybe, Sarah said quietly, you just needed someone to see past it. He looked at her. She nodded toward where Caleb had gone, onto the lawn, examining something in the grass with the total focus of a 6-year-old who has moved on to the next interesting thing. He saw it the first second, she said. He always does. I used to think it was naivety. I don't think that anymore. I think some people can see the actual structure of a person before the armor gets in the way. She paused. He's usually right. Ghost had the Harley out of Bill's shop and running in the parking lot by noon. Jackson stood with the engine ticking under his hand and felt the familiar warmth of it. The engine's heat, the idle vibration, the sense of a thing restored to working order. He'd been riding Harleys for 15 years, and they still felt, in moments like this, like the simplest true thing in his life. He reached into his breast pocket. He'd been carrying Ray's letter for 8 days. The envelope was slightly worn at the corners now, soft where he'd touched it and handled it, and carried it across Tennessee without opening it. He looked at it for a long moment in the noon heat of the motel parking lot. Then he slid his thumb under the flap. 2 pages. Ray's handwriting, familiar from 20 years of Christmas cards and chapter business and notes left under beer bottles at the end of long nights. Slightly unsteady now from the illness, the letters more deliberate, but unmistakably Ray. Jack, you stubborn son of a bitch. You're reading this because I'm gone, which means you've been carrying this letter for however long without opening it. And I know you, so that means at least a week, maybe 3. I'm writing this because there's something I should have said while I was alive and kept not saying, because you're not easy to say things to, and also because I kept thinking I had more time, which is the oldest mistake in the universe, and I'm sorry. Here's the thing. You are not the man you think you are. I know you've been telling yourself the darkness story for 20 years. You saw things. You did things. You became something the world had a name for, and you put on the name like a coat. And after a while you started to believe you were the coat. You were the patch and the leather and the scars like a sign that says stay away, and you've been so busy maintaining the sign that you forgot to check whether it was still true. I've ridden beside you for 15 years, Jack. I've seen you when nobody was watching. The money you left under Jenny Sawyer's door when Pete died and she had nothing. The kid in Tulsa at midnight, no family, no options, and you drove him to the hospital and stayed until they told you he was stable. 3 years ago in Phoenix. I know about Phoenix. You never told me, but I know, and I want you to know I know. The way you've always put yourself between the thing coming and the people who couldn't stop it. You are not the darkness. You have never been the darkness. You have always been standing in front of it. One last thing. Lily called me 2 months ago. She's doing well, better than well. She's whole, and she's strong, and she's built something real. Partly because of what she came through and partly because she has, whether she'd admit it or not, a hell of a lot of you in her. She told me she stopped being angry a long time ago. She told me she's just waiting for you to be ready. She didn't ask me to tell you this. But she's my brother's kid, and she's been waiting long enough. Call her Jack. Your brother, Ray Jackson, folded the letter. He sat with it in his hands for a while. The motel parking lot was quiet. A truck passed on the highway. A bird had established an opinion about something in the trees across the road and was stating it at length. You need a minute? Ghost said, no. Then, yes. Ghost sat down on the curb beside him and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. After a while, Jackson looked at his phone. He had Lily's number in his contacts, unchanged, for 3 years, a number he dialed as far as the third digit 4 separate times before stopping. He looked at it now. Ray says Lily's been waiting, he said. Ray was a wise man, Ghost said. He was an enormous pain in my ass. Those things are not mutually exclusive. Jackson dialed. It rang twice. Long enough for him to breathe. Long enough for the voice that said not your problem to try to say something and for him to, consciously and deliberately, not listen. Dad, Lily's voice. 19 years of distance and love and the particular grief of time you can't get back. All of it arriving at once through a phone in a motel parking lot in Millhaven, Tennessee. Hey, sweetheart, he said. His voice was steady. It didn't feel steady, but it came out that way, from long practice with the art of presenting more composure than you had. I'm sorry it's been so long. He stopped. I've been trying to figure out how to be worth calling, and I think I've been going about that wrong. A pause. Long enough that he held his breath. Dad, Lily said. She said it with the patient precision of someone clarifying something important. You don't have to earn calling me. You just have to call. He closed his eyes. Can I start there? He said. Can we start from there? Another pause. And then, and he would think about this moment for a very long time. Her voice when it came back was clear and open and unhurried. The voice of a door that had been left unlocked for 3 years. Waiting for someone to figure out he didn't need to knock. I've been waiting for you to say that, she said. 3 months later, in October. The trees along Route 9 had gone the color of old copper and new fire. The way Tennessee trees do in autumn, like they've been saving up for it all year. The air was cool enough to feel on your face through a helmet, and the road was the kind of road that deserved to be driven the long way. The custom Harley rolled into Millhaven just past 3 in the afternoon. Jackson parked in front of Rosie's. He was barely off the bike before the door opened and Rosie appeared in it, hands on her hips, the expression of a woman vindicating a bet she'd made with herself. Thought I'd never see you again, she said. I said I'd come back. Men say a lot of things. But she was already holding the door open. He'd come from Nashville. 2 days with Lily, her apartment, her cooking, her life, the boyfriend she'd been nervous to introduce, and who turned out to be steady and good, and exactly the kind of person whose existence made Jackson feel something complicated and grateful. 3 years of distance becoming something with a future to it, the way rivers become something else when they reach the sea. He'd been going to stop for coffee and drive on. 20 minutes off the route had felt like nothing at all. Caleb Morrison came out of the diner at a sprint, sneakers on October pavement, braid tail flying behind him. He'd grown 3/4 of an inch since August, the way children accelerate like they're trying to catch something. He hit the parking lot and skidded to a halt 6 feet from Jackson with 6-year-old dignity and the satisfied expression of someone whose arrangements have come out correctly. You came back, Caleb said. I said I would. Mom said adults don't always do what they say. Your mom is usually right, Jackson said. I'm working on being the exception. Caleb considered this with the gravity it deserved, and then nodded, accepting it. Sarah appeared in the doorway behind him, dish towel in hand, the shadow that had lived in the corners of her expression for months finally gone. Danny Voss was in federal custody awaiting trial on trafficking charges. Tom Haley had resigned and was cooperating with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence. Deputy Amy Chun had been confirmed as Sheriff Amy Chun 3 weeks ago by countywide vote, the first contested election in Millhaven in 11 years, which she had won by 17 percentage points. The pharmacy had put up a congratulations sign. Millhaven was still Millhaven, small, a little worn, imperfect in all the ordinary ways. But it moved differently, like a person does when they've been holding their breath for a long time and finally let it out. You look better, Sarah said. Slept, Jackson said. Called my daughter. How was that? Hard, he said. Good. He looked across the parking lot toward the road and the trees beyond it. Hard and good at the same time. Most of the things worth doing are, Sarah said. He stayed 2 hours. He had coffee and sweet potato pie and listened to Caleb explain, with impressive technical precision for a 6-year-old, and with the specific authority of someone who has conducted extensive YouTube research, the complete engineering specifications of a 2008 Harley-Davidson Road King Classic. He gave his honest opinion on 3 separate questions about motorcycles. He ate a second piece of pie because Rosie put it in front of him with the expression of someone who will not be argued with. And he was not a man who argued with Rosie. When he finally stood to go, Caleb caught the hem of his jacket. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." The boy looked up at him with those open creek water eyes that had never learned how to withhold a single thing they saw. "Are you happy now?" Caleb asked. Jackson was quiet for a moment. He thought about Lily across a dinner table, asking him careful questions and listening to his careful answers and laughing at something he said, an actual laugh, surprised out of her. He thought about Ray's letter in his breast pocket, worn soft now from being folded and unfolded, and read on 3 separate mornings in 3 separate places when he'd needed to be reminded of something. He thought about a night in Mill Haven, Tennessee, in August, when he'd stood in a doorway and held a line, and what it had felt like to be on the right side of something again for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure. He thought about a boy running across a gas station parking lot, straight at him, with absolutely no fear. Getting there, Jackson said, "Because of you, actually." Caleb blinked. "Because I asked if you were a superhero?" "Because you already knew the answer," Jackson said. "You just gave me time to catch up." Caleb thought about this with considerable seriousness. Then he nodded, the slow, conclusive nod of someone whose long-held hypothesis has received final empirical confirmation. "I knew it," he said. Jackson walked to his motorcycle. He stood beside it for a moment, hand on the throttle housing, feeling the familiar geometry of it under his palm. Then he kicked it to life. The engine found its voice, low, rolling, the sound that had followed him across 15 years of road and bad decisions and occasional grace. He pulled out of the lot. He did not look back right away. He waited until he'd cleared the first block, and then he checked his mirror. Caleb was still in the parking lot, waving, his whole arm, the way small children wave when they mean it completely, when they want to make sure the person they're waving at can absolutely see that they're waving from as far as the arm will reach. Jackson raised a hand. He rode north on Route 9, into the copper and fire trees, into the cool October air, into whatever came next. He thought, getting there.